In this episode, we talk about Israel's targeting of UN peacekeepers in Lebanon and India's response to the matter. We also discuss the highlights from the RSS Chief's latest speech on the occasion of Vijayadashami. But first, we talk about caste injustices inside Indian prisons. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, the Supreme Court struck down a series of rules that were part of various state prison manuals across the country. The court stated that these rules reinforced caste differences, targeted members of marginalized communities, and in doing so, violated the fundamental rights of prisoners. To discuss these rules and the significance of this judgment, we are joined by the Indian Express's Ajoy Sinha Karpuram, who writes on law for the paper. Ajoy, tell us, how did this matter reach the Supreme Court?
So the petition was filed by a journalist named Sukanya Shanta, who writes for The Wire and was working on a project with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. The project was called Barred the Prisons Project, and there was basically a series of 5 pieces that she wrote. And it was the first one called From Segregation to Labor, Manu's Caste Law Governs the Indian Prison System. And it was published on The Wire around December 2020. And taking note of this, the Supreme Court case was actually the second case that came out of this piece. The first case that came out of it was the Rajasthan High Court taking suo motu cognizance of it, which is when a High Court takes note of a development and of its own accord sort of initiates a case. So the Rajasthan High Court took note of a lot of the Rajasthan's own prison manual rules and struck down a lot of them in 2020. And a couple of years after that, in 2023, Sukanya Shanta filed a PIL at the Supreme Court. Even though, obviously, the subject matter of this case doesn't directly relate to her, she filed a public interest litigation in public interest. And basically highlighting manuals and rules in a whole host of states: Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and a bunch of others. She said both directly and indirectly, these rules segregated prisoners on the basis of caste, segregated labor inside prisons on the basis of caste, and violated a host of fundamental rights along with that.
And so for those who may not already know about this, tell us in what ways these prison manuals and their rules did that.
So I can give you some examples right off the bat. In UP, for instance, the one rule says that anyone under simple imprisonment, that's basically imprisonment without hard labor. So anyone under simple imprisonment shall not be called upon to perform duties of a degrading or menial character unless he belongs to a class or community accustomed to performing such duties.
Oh, so it's actually stating that in very plain terms.
So this is actually one of the more indirect examples. For example, in the Madhya Pradesh rules or the Madhya Pradesh manual, for the latrine parade, which is their sort of check on whether the prisoners have properly cleaned out their toilets in their cells, it specifically says that people from the Mehtar community, which is a scheduled caste community, should be assigned to these checking duties and should to see if they've properly put the amount of dirt over it, and in case it hasn't been properly, to clean those cubicles out. And yeah, there are a couple of other examples which are fairly blatantly invoking caste. In West Bengal's rules, and West Bengal is not unique in this sense either, one of the rules explicitly states interference with genuine religious practices or caste prejudices of prisoners should be avoided. And I believe the Andhra Pradesh rules also have a similar rule that says allowance for caste prejudice. So there are some direct invocations of caste and a sort of non-interference policy in a lot of these manuals. Not only non-interference, but actively sort of allowing certain practices to take place.
And since when had these rules been in practice?
So it can be traced back to the British Raj. There was a committee on prison discipline that was convened between 1836 and 1838, and which made a host of recommendations for better prison administration obviously being in courts. It recommended that prisoners be divided on caste lines within prisons and that each group of prisoners should be assigned their own cook, and also talked about how labor should be divided among these groups of people. It said that forcing a man of a higher caste to work any trade such as sweeping or the like would disgrace his family. And it appears that this was a cornerstone of the policy under the British Raj. A lot of this non-interference and a lot of case active acceptance of caste discrimination or sort of caste prejudices was very much a part of their prison administration policy. So it's not just labor here. It's not just labor and cooks. It's also in terms of, at least under the British Raj, in terms of the punishments that were handed out.
So punishments would be handed out differently based on the caste of the person.
So the UP's manual from 1899 says that whipping, which was a common punishment at the time, could not be used against quote-unquote superior class prisoners in UP without the government's permission. So yeah, there was discrimination even in terms of the punishment that was handed out to people.
And had there been attempts in the past to strike down these rules?
So there have been some. In 2014, for instance, in the Madras High Court, a man was trying to get his brother moved out where his brother had been incarcerated in a wing with a lot of folks who were dealing with mental health issues. And another part of his plea was to end caste-based discrimination in prisons. In a very short order in 2014, the Madras High Court accepted the submission of the government, where the government said there was a lot of rivalry between groups on account of caste feeling, and basically in order to avoid any flare-ups within the prison, that these sorts of practices were adopted. And they also argued that this was based on community and not caste. That distinction is not made very clear in the order itself, but the Madras High Court seemed to accept this argument and let it out. After that, there was the Rajasthan High Court ruling that we spoke about earlier, and then the Supreme Court case that came to our notice now.
And so while striking down these rules, talk about what the Supreme Court highlighted in its final judgment.
So I'd say there are two main takeaways from this. One main takeaway is the straightforward one, how these rules violate fundamental rights, and I'll get to that later. The other main takeaway is how the Supreme Court spoke about how these rules are from a bygone era, from a colonial era, and that we're an era that we need to move past. And a lot of these prejudices and the way prison administration is handled is very much informed by how it was handled by then. For example, almost every single one of these rules has a sort of classification of habitual versus non-habitual offenders. And some rules talk about segregating these offenders from each other. But the Supreme Court talks about how this language of habitual versus non-habitual offenders traces back to the Criminal Tribes Act, where in, I believe, 1871 was when the Criminal Tribes Act was first passed. Basically, on this notion that certain communities and certain tribes are born criminals and that they will be criminals for the rest of their life. And if they have kids, those kids will also be criminals. And basically decided to restrict their movement around them, restrict their movement, place obligations on villages to report the movement of these people if they're outside sort their territorial limits that they've been assigned. And these wandering tribes, quote unquote, were restricted to a area. And unless they had an occupation that was seen as respectable, they could very easily be notified as a criminal tribe. And the Supreme Court talks about how notions of habitual offenders, people who seem inclined towards certain activities or certain crimes, is directly harkens back to this notion that some people are born criminals. And the other thing was the constitutionality of it all, which is, one is that the right to equality, the Supreme Court said, is caste can be used as a basis for differing between groups, but that's only in cases where, such as reservation, you're trying to uplift a certain group. You're acknowledging that a certain group has dealt with historical oppression, and you're trying to uplift them and put them on a level playing field with everyone else.
Basically for affirmative action.
Basically affirmative action, absolutely. So the Supreme Court said you cannot use this caste as a basis on the complete flip side and then say, okay, we're going to use this to segregate prisoners inside prisons. The specific language was segregating prisoners on the basis of caste would reinforce caste differences or animosities that ought to be prevented in the first place. And besides that, there's also the right against discrimination, where the Supreme Court said it both these manuals, as I explained earlier, both directly and indirectly discriminate against prisoners by using language such as people who are accustomed to certain acts. Like some of these manuals talk about how certain kinds of jobs should only be given to prisoners who are accustomed to performing that kind of labor. Then it talked about how these kinds of rules sort of cement practices of untouchability inside prisons by sort of assigning work to certain communities. and how that also amounts to forced labor. Now, I understand that it may seem a little counterintuitive to talk about forced labor in the context of prisons, but the court talks about how, even in the context of prisons, the way you're distributing work cannot be on the basis of these communities, and that you are not allowing certain communities to access certain kinds of work, that certain kinds of work that may be more meaningful and allow a certain amount of growth, or that might just be a preference.
And can you talk about the significance of this ruling from the context of prison reforms? Because this is not something that a lot of people care about, because for a lot of people, prisons are supposed to be punishments, even though they are meant to be rehabilitative. So could you talk about this ruling from that context?
So the most notable instance of the Supreme Court sort of stepping into prisons per se and talking about the fundamental rights of prisoners was possibly in 1978 in the Sunil Batra versus Delhi administration case, where the Supreme Court finally held that just because you've entered a prison doesn't mean your fundamental rights just disappear. Or rather, the words they use, I believe they used, were fleed. Like, your fundamental rights don't flee from you just because you enter the prisons. Some of them may be diluted. For example, Article 19(1)(g) gives you the right to move freely throughout the territory of India, and that's not something that's you're going to be allowed to do when you're in a prison. But that doesn't mean you cannot have access to certain dignity and life when you're inside a prison, especially considering that a huge portion of the prison population in the country are under trials. They have not been convicted of anything quite yet. It's because cases take as long as they do that they're in prison at the time. So it's important to understand that not every prisoner in a prison is there because of a heinous crime. That's a smaller percentage. In reality, there are a lot of under trials. There are a lot of people who are there for petty offenses. And one of the things the Supreme Court speaks about is Article 21, the right to life with dignity, and how there should be an opportunity for growth. One part of the right to life with dignity is an opportunity for the growth of an individual's personality. And that doesn't go away even when you're in prison.
And so what happens now? Do we know what will be done with these prison manuals going forward?
So in 2016, the center published a model prison manual. And there's also a draft version of an act called the Model Prisons and Correctional Services Act, where sort of handling prison administration, and the model prison manual is supposed to be basically telling states, base your manuals off of this. So the Supreme Court has said both of these need to be amended or changed to directly address caste discrimination in prisons. And with the closing of this case, the Supreme Court actually, in the tail end of that judgment, initiates another case, a suo motu case, called In Re Discrimination Inside Prisons in India. And in 3 months, both the center and the states that have been sort of party to this case have been asked to come back to the Supreme Court and give an update on where they are in terms of eliminating these rules, eliminating these practices inside prisons. And the center is going to give an update on where they are in terms of changing the model prison manual and the 2023 act that's currently in a draft version that has not been passed yet.
And next we talk about the ongoing war in the Middle East. Last week, Israel came under further scrutiny after its forces attacked the headquarters of the United Nations peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, injuring 2 peacekeepers. This attack even prompted India, which has carefully navigated the diplomatic landscape, to express concern over the situation and take a stance against Israel's military actions. Now, to understand the current context, it's important to note that toward the end of September, the Israeli government had added a new objective to its year-long war in Gaza.
So the 2 objectives that were defined by the Israeli government earlier were dismantling or destroying Hamas and release of the hostages.
That's Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor, Shubhajit Roy.
Now, late September, they added one more objective, which was that return of Israelis in the northern Israel territory. So the context was that, after about 11 and a half months of war, what Israeli military feels is that it has been able to substantially degrade and dismantle Hamas. So Hamas's operatives have died, Hamas's combatants have died, they have been able to kill the top leadership of Hamas. There are about 15,000 combatants from Hamas have died in Gaza, and they have been able to also destroy much of the infrastructure, say missile factories and tunnels and all of that. Now they were trying to shift the focus to Hezbollah, which is essentially in Lebanon, based in Lebanon, and southern Lebanon is where they're mostly based at, and in Beirut, the Hezbollah's leadership, it is based out of.
Now, it's important to note that Israel shares its border with Lebanon in the north. And when Israel started its war on Gaza last year, Hezbollah, the Islamist militant group backed by Iran, started firing rockets and missiles in the northern Israeli territory.
So a lot of Israelis had to evacuate, and they had to be evacuated, and it is said about more than 60,000, about 63,000 to 68,000 people were relocated from northern Israel territories to central areas. So Israel government essentially was saying that now they're going to go after Hezbollah so that they stop firing missiles and stop firing rockets on northern Israeli territory. And only then the Israelis who lived in that area can go back to their homes and where they lived before the war started. So now, after end of September and early October, what we have seen an aggressive Israeli military, not just making aerial strikes, but also has now started ground operations in what is called the Blue Line, which is sort of the border between Israel and Lebanon.
And this is the area guarded by the United Nations peacekeeping forces, also called UNIFIL.
UNIFIL stands for UN Interim Force in Lebanon. So there are said to be about 10,500 UN troops, of which about 900 are Indian troops. So they're all operating under the UN Peacekeeping Forces operations flag. So the blue helmets, essentially, what we know. So that's where the Indian connection has come in this war between Israel and Hezbollah.
Now, Israel justifies its actions by claiming that Hezbollah operatives were using UN facilities as shields while targeting the Israeli military, forcing them to retaliate.
So, according to the UN, the Israeli military fired at UN peacekeepers, and they wounded 2 UN peacekeepers, and they happened to be from Sri Lanka. And they were wounded in this Israeli offensive on Friday near their watchtower in a place called Nakura in South Lebanon. And there were blasts which shook the peacekeepers' main base in the area. And this was the second time in 48 hours that Israeli forces had battled the Hezbollah in that particular area. So UNIFIL obviously reacted very strongly and called it serious development and said the security of UN personnel and property must be guaranteed. As I said before, that the UNIFIL force has more than 10,000 peacekeepers from dozens of countries, and Indian troops account for the second largest number, with about 900 personnel serving there. After this incident, a joint statement by about 34 troop contributing countries, they strongly condemned the attacks on the UNIFIL peacekeepers and said that such actions must stop immediately and should be adequately investigated.
He says that while the 34 troop contributing countries put out a statement on Saturday, India initially was not part of it.
But India put out a statement about an hour and a half later at around 8:35 p.m. Indian Standard Time on Saturday, aligning itself with the statement that had come an hour and a half back, where essentially the Indian Permanent Mission of India at the UN in New York, they said in a post on X, and they said that as a major troop contributing country, India aligns itself fully with the joint statement issued by the 34 UNIFIL troop contributing countries. Safety and security of peacekeepers are of paramount importance and must be ensured in accordance with extant UNSC resolutions. So essentially, putting their weight behind the UN peacekeepers and underlying the importance of the safety and security of the UN peacekeepers. So this, to me, is very significant because this is possibly the first time after almost a year of balancing act between Palestine and Israel and the other parties that India has sort of spoken out or aligned itself against Israeli military's action against the two UN peacekeepers in Lebanon.
And in the end, we talk about the RSS, the ideological parent of the Bharatiya Janata Party. At a time when the Congress has been focusing on caste and demanding a nationwide caste census, RSS Chief Mohan Bhagwat, as part of his Vijayadashami speech on Saturday, called for the larger Hindu community to reach out to the depressed classes to build a cohesive Hindu society. When we spoke to Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwary, he told us about it.
The most important aspect was that he particularly spelled out as to what the Hindu society needs to do to remain united, and he touched upon the issue of caste discrimination. And although this is not a new issue that he has spoken about caste discrimination in many of his speeches. Even in the last Dashara speech, he had spoken about caste discrimination.
Yeah, because for the RSS, an organization that wants to unite Hindus, caste is what comes in the middle of that.
Correct. So RSS believes that if we have to fight the other enemy, whichever community that is, so the first, our own society needs to be united. And because this is a unique character of the Hindu society, the caste system, so RSS believes that we have to override this caste division that is there in the society to put up a united face and then fight the enemy or any threat that is there to the Hindu society which they perceive. So while this has been a long-standing argument, he keeps talking about that, we do support reservations, and, he has earlier said that if 2000 years of discrimination requires 200 years of reservation, I'm for it. But this time he went ahead and spelled it out that you have to participate in each other's festivals. So he said that why should Valmiki Jayanti be celebrated only in a Valmiki colony? Or why should Ravidas Jayanti be, not in as many words, but he suggested that why should Ravidas Jayanti be celebrated only by Dalits? So basically he's asking the larger Hindu society to participate in functions and festivals of Dalits.
Right, and talk about what stands out to you about the timing of this speech.
So we have to understand also that this is the first Vijayadashami speech after 2024 polls by Mohan Bhagwat. In 2024 polls, BJP put up an underwhelming performance, finishing at 240 seats and falling short of majority. And this, many understand that this happened due to Dalits moving away from the party in the fear that a 400 plus result for the BJP would lead to change in the constitution and so also impact reservations for Dalits and other backward classes. So that's how these communities moved away from the BJP, and Mohan Bhagwat, being the head of an organization which is the ideological fountainhead of the BJP, understands the threat that it poses to the BJP and also to his own organization. And so he has been consistently pitching at this. This time he had to spell out, and he spent a lot of time talking about it. And he spoke for a long time on this issue alone.
And besides this, he also spoke about how the Hindu society should practice restraint and should not get provoked. Tell us, how exactly did he communicate that?
So first he says that, there are these incidents of stone pelting on religious processions, and he specifically spoke about the Ganesh Visarjan. So he was probably referring to an incident of communal flare-up in Thane district in Maharashtra, near Mumbai, which had happened during Ganesh Visarjan. And it was typically associated with some procession going in front of a mosque, and there was some stone pelting. So he made a reference to that, and then he spoke about that Hindus need to be prepared to guard themselves, to protect themselves against such attacks. So he said that you have to understand that lions are not sacrificed, goats are. So basically telling the Hindu community, don't become a goat, don't become a sheep. But he also said after that you have to exercise restraint. You may not like what somebody is saying, or you are sensitive towards what is happening in the society and you want to express yourself, but you have to express yourself with restraint. And you cannot use words which demean anyone's religion, anyone's deities, anyone's place of worship and the like. In fact, I asked some RSS people that these two things they don't seem to be, meeting. There is no meeting ground anywhere. So this person said that basically what he means is that you have to wear your strength so that the enemy is aware that you're strong enough to protect yourself and it does not engage with you. You don't have to exhibit your strength physically, but the enemy must be aware that you're strong enough so that it does not engage with you.
Okay, and the other thing that Bhagwat spoke about was what he called a rapid slide in societal values. And he has spoken about this in the past as well. But this time, he said that OTT platforms were to blame for it. And he called for a regulation of these platforms through legislation.
So let's understand that this is coming with the background that Hindutva outfits have had a lot of problems with some of the content on OTT platforms. There was massive controversy about a Netflix movie, Tamil movie, where it was suggested that the hunting of the deer by Lord Ram was basically for its meat. And this was very unpalatable to some of the Hindutva groups that, who suggested that everybody was vegetarian because religion has now become vegetarian. Although this is also very strange because RSS has never ever pushed for vegetarianism.
Oh, it's never done that?
It has never pushed for vegetarianism. In fact, in many RSS meetings earlier, meat has been served and people eat the meat in RSS. People have this wrong notion. This vegetarianism business, it's not even part of Sangh discourse. So this vegetarian business in, say, Hindutva political discourse has come in the past 10 years. In fact, Sangh has never advocated what people should eat. Sangh does not get into this business. So there was a controversy on that and the movie had to be removed. Then we all know that there was a series called Tandav in which a certain projection of Hindutva politics in the serial on Prime Videos was objected to, and there was some legal case also. So there have been numerous such occasions when Hindutva groups have had problems with, and there have been demands from various circles of regulation of OTT platforms. And so RSS Chief articulating it is very, very significant because that gives a signal to the government that you need to do something about it.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.